Your world just got more complicated. What does it mean for Canada? What does it mean for you? Welcome to a special edition of Nature Labs. I'm your host, Simon Jackson, and class starts right now.
Peter Bureau, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Nature Labs yet again. You are obviously one of Canada's leading experts on democracy. You're the founder of Section 1 and SIDE, Students in Democracy Education, which is a partner of Nature Labs. But you've also written the book on the Notwithstanding Clause. And that's why we're here to talk today, because the Notwithstanding Clause, an obscure clause in Canada's Constitution, is back in the news, and it's something that most people don't really understand. So we wanted to get together to dig into the subject a bit more so that we can all get on the same page. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is the Notwithstanding Clause?
The Notwithstanding Clause is one of the most consequential and least understood, or least well understood provisions in our Constitution. It's a clause that is part of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a key constitutional document, which in 1982 was enacted and agreed to by all of the provinces following what was then called patriation of our Constitution, because prior to that time, our Constitution was known as the British North America Act. And in fact, it was an imperial statute of the British Parliament. It wasn't a Canadian statute at all. And what happened was in 1982, under then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, all of the provinces, save and except for Quebec, agreed to patriate the Constitution, essentially to create a made in Canada Constitution with a made in Canada Charter of Rights and Freedoms and a made in Canada amending formula that gave Canada the power and the ability to amend, to change its constitution going forward. The Notwithstanding Clause is one provision in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That charter embodies, acknowledges, and protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadians, including such things as freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, opinion, expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, the fundamental freedom of life, liberty, and security of the person, and of course, equality rights. And those are essential freedoms that belong to every Canadian, not because the Constitution says so, but because they are inherent fundamental freedoms, which are recognized by the Constitution, the Charter, as being inalienable and essential to every citizen, in fact, to every person, including non-citizens. But rights and freedoms, as you know, aren't absolute. They bump into each other. They compete with each other. They conflict with societal interests from time to time. And when that happens, there has to be some way of resolving those conflicts. And in acknowledging the kinds of limitations or restrictions on rights, which are permissible in a free and democratic society such as Canada, and those which are not. There's a provision called Section 1 of the Charter that not only recognizes those fundamental freedoms and guarantees them, but it also says that those fundamental rights and freedoms can only be limited or restricted in a way that's consistent with the societal arrangements in a free and democratic society, right? There's an exception. So Section 1 of the Charter, which does that, which is called the Reasonable Limits Clause, sets out the test for how a limitation or a restriction, can be justified. All right. And there's a test called the Section 1 test. That's normally the way in which you would think in a free and democratic society, we accept and acknowledge and agree to live by the limitations that government sets for rights and freedoms. There's an exception to that, and that's Section 33 of the Charter, the Notwithstanding Clause. So this is a very long-winded way of getting to the answer to your question, but we really can't understand the answer to that question if we don't have this background. Section 33 of the Charter says that a law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Charter, with certain specific provisions of the Charter, the fundamental rights and freedoms, conscience, religion, association, assembly, and of course, expression, and also life, liberty, security of the person, the legal rights, such as, the right to counsel, the right to, fair trials and those kinds of things, and equality rights. Those particular rights and freedoms are subject to this notwithstanding clause, which says that a law that infringes those particular rights or is inconsistent with a provision that guarantees those particular rights shall operate notwithstanding the inconsistency, notwithstanding the infringement, if certain formal conditions are met. And this is a very different way of talking about restrictions or limitations of rights from the way that Section 1 does it, which lays out this test that says you can only limit or restrict rights and freedoms if you meet a variety of requirements, the proportionality test, and an elaborate test that allows a court to say that a limitation or a restriction on a right or freedom is demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, doesn't say anything about limiting rights in a way that's consistent with respect for those rights, that's consistent with the values of a free and democratic society. It says something completely different. It says Parliament or the provinces, not the municipal governments, but Parliament, the federal government, or the provincial legislatures, can do at any time they want, so long as they meet certain formal requirements that we don't need to get into right now. And it doesn't say that the rights and freedoms don't exist. It essentially says they are overridden insofar as a particular law is concerned. That law shall be allowed to operate notwithstanding those provisions in the Charter. And that's why it's called the notwithstanding clause. Now, it's controversial because it's a provision that allows government to restrict rights without having to satisfy that important reasonable limits test set out in Section 1, right? It allows government to restrict or limit rights simply because they say so, simply because they decide that they're going to do it. However, that doesn't mean that there is no accountability politically or democratically. There is, because a law that limits rights pursuant to Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, does so through an act of Parliament, where presumably the restriction on the rights and the purpose of the law that is having the restrictive or limiting effect is going to be debated in the legislature, federal or provincial. So there is debate, there is discussion, there is disclosure, there is argument, and there may be evidence that's marshaled by, the government seeking to enact a law that overrides rights. And there are a number of formal requirements that have to be met that really go to the question of accountability politically for a government that seeks to limit those rights. However, it's a very controversial clause because when you think that you've got civil liberties protected by a charter, you would imagine that government can't just choose to override the charter simply because it wants to, even if it has, a clear majority in the legislature to do it. The whole point of a liberal constitutional democracy is that majority rule should never operate to override minority rights. That's the difference between other kinds of democracies where you just have majority rule, plain and simple. But, majorities often make mistakes. Majorities often act unjustly, maliciously. Majorities often intend to override the rights of minorities. Not always, but that occurs. A liberal democracy with a charter of rights seeks to mitigate that risk of the erosion of minority rights, the transgression of fundamental rights that are intended to protect those who are not in the majority. Now, those who defend the Notwithstanding Clause, because after all, it was negotiated into the Charter in 1982, they defend it on the basis of principles of democracy. And they say, look, the courts, which normally decide questions about whether there's been a rights infringement or not, and as a corollary to that, questions about whether an infringing law should be struck down or somehow modified or invalidated in some way in order to accommodate the rights and protect the rights, or at least to minimize the impairment of the rights of those affected by that law, right? You would, what the defenders of the Notwithstanding Clause say is, well, courts shouldn't be the only body that makes that kind of decision. Parliaments, made up of elected members of the community, of society, are just as fit to make those kinds of decisions for Canadian citizens. Why should we prefer the decisions of unelected, appointed judges who are not accountable to society except through their decisions, which, if they're wrong, can be appealed, but that's about it? Right? Why should we defer to the decisions of unelected, unaccountable judges, these people say, as opposed to deferring to the will of the people as expressed through the laws passed and motions passed in democratically elected legislatures? That's their position. And they're defending what used to be called this idea of parliamentary sovereignty. In fact, even parliamentary supremacy. It says, Parliament or the legislature is supreme over everyone else and over all other branches of government. Well, when we introduced the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, we sought to attenuate or to soften that principle of parliamentary sovereignty and say, well, you know what? It's not Parliament that's supreme. It's the Constitution that must be supreme. The Constitution must be supreme over all levels of government and over all persons, including those who occupy the executive branches of government. So there's an interesting tension between those who want to defend the Notwithstanding Clause as being properly democratically legitimate, right? And those who say the Notwithstanding Clause has no place in the Constitution of a liberal constitutional democracy with a Charter of Rights. And there isn't a right answer to that contest between those positions. It's a balancing that goes on indefinitely. And in a robust democracy, we continue to have that discussion. But what happens is that each time in which a government invokes the Notwithstanding Clause to protect it from the power of the court or the discretion of the court to strike it down because it offends a charter provision, we as a society have, or at least ought to have, a vigorous discussion amongst ourselves about what's going on and whether we think this is legitimate, whether we think this is good for our civic culture, whether it's good for society, or whether it's a terrible thing. Unfortunately, in the real world, we don't have the kinds of high quality debates in our legislatures that we would hope to have so that these issues can really be aired. And so the courts tend to be the place where there is a much more intensive, exhaustive, and really high quality discussion about the effect of a law on a right or freedom. And what the Notwithstanding Clause does when it is properly invoked is it says to the courts, well, you can't strike down the law, regardless of what you think about whether there's been a rights infringement. You can't strike it down. It continues to operate. Now, where there is still a huge controversy, and the Supreme Court of Canada is going to decide this very soon in its in its decision, which hasn't yet been argued, on appeal from the Quebec Court of Appeal in the Bill 21 case, the hijab law, the religious symbols law, and also, by the way, on appeal from the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal in the You Are Pride case, which is the pronouns case, right? Which went the opposite way of the Quebec Court of Appeal. What the court is going to decide is really, to my mind, the central question that's going to determine whether the notwithstanding clause is still kind of okay to have and to use, or whether it needs to be excised from our Constitution altogether. And that's the question of whether proper invocation of the notwithstanding clause, in other words, invocation that does result in saving a law that offends certain provisions of the Charter, whether that invocation ousts the jurisdiction of the court, that is, it preempts the ability of the court to undertake judicial review for the purpose of saying there has been a rights infringement. So there are those who say that once the notwithstanding clause has been invoked, the court has no power or jurisdiction to even answer the question, has there been a rights infringement? That's what the Quebec Court of Appeal said. The Saskatchewan Court of Appeal said, and the book that you referenced that I edited is liberally cited in that case, comes to what I think is the correct view of this, which is that even though a law can be saved and can be allowed to operate, notwithstanding its inconsistency with a charter provision, that does not prevent the court from nevertheless looking into the effect of the law on charter rights. Because even if the law is protected and can continue to operate, the court there said, and I say, and I hope the Supreme Court will agree, that the citizens of Canada still have an interest in knowing from an authoritative body, from an expert body, whether there has been a rights infringement, what the effect of that rights infringement ordinarily would be on the exercise of rights and freedoms, and also potentially what remedies might still be appropriate to issue from the court, short of striking the law down, which is precluded by virtue of the notwithstanding clause. So that's kind of the framework. And that's the major question that the Supreme Court of Canada has not yet answered, but it's critically important, because if we live in a free and democratic society, and even if we believe that there should be a healthy competition or contest between the democratically elected legislature, all right, and the appointed judiciary over questions of whether rights have been infringed or not, even if we accept that, surely, in my view, we should all agree that it's important from a public education standpoint, all right, from a democratic deliberation standpoint, to know and to understand whether there has been a rights infringement. That enables us to engage in future debates about whether we want to oppose the extension or renewal of the notwithstanding clause after its 5-year sunset, all right, its 5-year expiry date, if you will, which is automatic every time it's invoked. It allows us to have an intelligent discussion about whether we would extend it or oppose it, because we have the benefit, on my view, and on the view of the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, of a judicial opinion that explains to us what right is an issue and whether it's been infringed and to what extent. So there's simply no downside to the court continuing to have that power and jurisdiction to answer those questions for citizens who, while they may suffer the effect of an infringing law continuing to operate under the notwithstanding clause, nevertheless get the benefit of the court's opinion as to whether there has been a rights infringement. That's a remedy, even if it's not the ideal remedy, which would be, make them stop doing it. Read it down, invalidate it, strike it down. Even if that remedy is not available, citizens in a free and democratic society, self-governing citizens, right, ought to know what the effect and consequence of laws are on their fundamental rights and freedoms.
I think you've highlighted this issue and the complexity of it in a really profound way, because this goes to the heart of our democracy, and more importantly, I think it goes to the fact that our understanding of how our system works isn't that deep, and we don't really have that arena anymore where we can have these robust conversations, safe for the courts, as you said. I'm a little bit curious about sort of some of the increasing use of it, because this was sort of considered to be a worst case scenario, quasi veto for the legislatures or parliament in extenuating circumstances. But it seems to be used with increasing frequency. Do you think there's a reason why we're seeing it more? Is that a reflection of the increasing divides we see in our society? Is it a reflection of our lack of democratic literacy we see in society? And if you say that the court can't necessarily remedy that clause in the Constitution itself, what might be the remedy in a free and democratic society like Canada's? And especially, what role might there be for, say, a high school student in this debate to figure out how and can and where it should be used, and if there is a way to put some guardrails on it, if you will?
So you ask a really interesting question. And there are, again, as with all interesting questions about important and complex problems like this, many sides to the issue and many different answers. I have attempted to answer the very question that you're asking, and I do it in a chapter in the book that you referenced, the Notwithstanding Clause in the Canadian Charter, in a chapter which I have titled Chekhov's Gun Inverted. Now, Chekhov was a great playwright, as you know, and your students will know. Wrote many incredibly important plays, and he was a great dramaturge, a great theorist of the theater as well, not just a playwright. And Chekhov's gun theory was a very interesting theory. It was that if you place a gun, and it's kind of a metaphor, but if you place a gun on the stage in the set, then that gun must be fired at some point in the play, because by placing the gun in the set, you've created an expectation on the part of the audience that it's going to be used. All right. So you must use it. And if you fail to use it, you're going to disappoint the audience. I use that kind of metaphor and I say Chekhov's gun inverted. And I say, if you place a gun in the scene, it will be used inevitably. If it's there, the temptation will be to use it. And obviously what I'm saying is that if you put the Notwithstanding Clause in the Charter, it's going to be used. It's not that, it ought to be used or it ought not to be used. It will be used because it's there. It's there. And what's happening is, as you said, rightly, it's being used with increasing frequency, roughly now once a year. It was originally, invoked. It was originally invoked by the Quebec government right off the bat. Quebec government that never signed on to the charter, to the patriation package, right on day one when the charter was enacted, and it was applied to Quebec's entire statute book. The Quebec government said, we're going to simply invoke it now. We never signed on to this charter, but since we've got one, and since it's got a Notwithstanding Clause, we're going to use the Notwithstanding Clause to effectively minimize the amount of charter scrutiny to which our laws are subject. Okay? That was tested, and I won't go into the jurisprudential history. Quebec continued to use it regularly. But outside of Quebec, it was rarely used. And when it was initially enacted as part of the charter in 82, there was what was known at the time as the rare use doctrine. And, Jean Chrétien, when he introduced when he introduced the enactment of the charter to Parliament, at the time he was Justice Minister under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, he said, look, this is going to be very rarely used. It's going only in exceptional, extraordinary circumstances. And most of the drafters and negotiators of the charter thought that that was the case. They turned out to be wrong. And my view, I think, is being borne out, which is it's a tool that's there, a very powerful one, one that can be used to counter the effect of the courts placing restrictions around what legislatures can do by simply enacting a law that says the courts be damned, this law is going to apply. And that is happening with increasing frequency. Now, it's interesting to note that Parliament, the federal government, has not to date ever invoked the Notwithstanding Clause, although the current leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, has virtually promised to invoke it for a whole host of purposes. One of them in terms of amending the criminal code, bail reform, and a bunch of issues where he doesn't want his tough on crime agenda to be neutered, if you will, by the court. But so far, Parliament hasn't used it. Only provincial governments, and not every provincial government, but a good number of them now, have invoked it. At the end of the day, there's an interesting discussion that goes on in civil society, in our media, in the newspapers, in our classrooms, and in the streets, hopefully, about whether the use by a government of the Notwithstanding Clause is a good thing or not. Alberta recently invoked it. It's the most recent invocation of the Notwithstanding Clause for the purpose, essentially, of protecting legislation that severely restricts the collective bargaining power of a union. I won't go into the details of the case. It really doesn't matter. What's important is that they've done that. There's a law that they want to introduce, and they don't want striking workers to disrupt certain activities. Not that long ago, the government of Ontario did exactly the same thing. And there was a major public outcry because the right to strike had already been identified as a protected right within the meaning of the right of association and the right of assembly, but specifically the right of association, one of the fundamental rights and freedoms in the Charter. And Ontarians were livid that having already, the Supreme Court of Canada having already recognized a constitutional right to strike, was somehow now being undermined by the use of the Notwithstanding Clause that said, well, notwithstanding the right to strike, we're passing a law that is effectively going to override that right. There was such an outcry and there was so much debate that the government of Ontario, it was Premier Doug Ford, actually withdrew the law and backed down on his plan to move forward with the Notwithstanding Clause promulgation. All right. So there is reason to believe that when the Notwithstanding Clause is invoked, it can generate a certain amount of very healthy debate and dialogue in civil society around the propriety of its use, the efficacy of it, the advisability of it, its impact on civil liberties, the extent to which the right that's limited is important relative to the societal interest that the government is seeking to advance or to protect with the law, the infringing law, the impugned law. That's a very healthy thing. And it turned out to be a very good and positive experience in Ontario. We don't know whether that, ultimately is how things will play out in Alberta. But what we do know is that if a government wants to stick to its guns on the Notwithstanding Clause, it can do so. It can simply do so and invoke it. And that leaves the question of whether the court still has the authority and the jurisdiction to comment, not on the operability of the law, but at least on the question of whether there has been a rights infringement, a rights violation. that, but for the invocation of the law, would result in a remedy such as striking down the law as being of no force and effect because it's inconsistent with the charter.
This, I think, leaves us with one fundamental point, which is that people are going to have different opinions on this particular section in our Constitution. It exists, as you say. It's being used, clearly. And the debate that maybe should be had by reasonable people with different opinions on this is best done through a robust democracy. But you have articulated at numerous points in our conversations, of which you'll be seeing on Nature Labs in our forthcoming series of Canadian sovereignty, and of course in your side series that we'll be sharing, and I just want to talk about right now, in that our democracy is fragile and in many ways is under threat. And if we want to have this debate about whether the Notwithstanding Clause is a valid clause, is an invalid clause, really, we first need to understand why democracy matters, and contribute to the robust nature of our democracy. And ultimately, that isn't the job of a prime minister or a premier. That's the job of every single citizen, including those who are in high school right now. So on a final point, tell us about Section 1 side and the opportunity students have to learn more about their democracy and how that platform can enable them to have the kind of debate that you've been talking about today.
Thank you for that. And I agree with your observation. It's so critically important. It really comes down to that question about whether we want to live in a democracy or not. But even more fundamentally, if we do, or if we say we do, why do we want to live in a democracy? What does that really mean? And, you know, the shortest answer I can give to that question is, if we want to live as the free citizens and as the equal moral persons that we are, that we were when we came into the world, when we were born, if we want to live as free and equal citizens, then liberal democracy is the only way to do that. It doesn't mean it's an ideal political arrangement, but it's the best one that we've come up with so far that advances the cause of freedom and agency. Agency meaning our ability to control our destinies, not just individually, but collectively as a society. Our ability to advance the cause of our own freedom, our ability to be self-governing, to be self-determining. You hear people talk about self-determination, peoples all over the world, and the declaration of, of statehood or ostensible statehood all over the world. People need to stop to think about what's really going on in those kinds of conversations. It's about this question of agency. Do we want to promote societal arrangements in which people not only are free, but continue to be free and self-governing? That's what a democracy is. Or do they want to subordinate their free agency to something else? And there are all kinds of very interesting arguments for other kinds of societal arrangements. Theocracies, even dictatorships, oligarchies of various kinds. It depends on what your value system is and also your understanding about the nature of human nature. But on my view of the world, we come into the world as free and equal moral persons. By the way, that doesn't mean that we come into the world with any competence whatsoever to govern ourselves. So that's something we have to learn. That's something we have to be taught. That's something that we need to be conditioned into. All right. And that's what Section 1 is about, which you asked me about, and thank you for that. It's about moving us from merely being free and equal human beings to becoming competent self-governors. All right. And there are many, many ways in which we can arrange our affairs to do that. All right. It doesn't mean that every person is involved directly in government and politics, but it does mean that a society of free citizens requires that freedom to be supported by a certain kind of enlightenment and a certain kind of conditioning, failing which that freedom is going to disappear very quickly. And that agency is going to disappear very quickly. So what Section 1 is about it really has two sides to it. One is kind of the think tank piece that studies the problem of freedom and equality and liberal constitutionalism and the phenomenon that we call democratic decline or democratic backsliding, all right, where free societies are kind of falling back into some form of illiberalism and authoritarianism. The other piece is really the most important piece. It's the civics education piece. It's the public education piece, where we focus on conditioning citizens to live as free and equal moral persons competent to govern themselves collectively as free and equal moral persons, to protect that freedom and their agency. And the program I think that you referred to earlier, SIDE, or Students in Democracy Education, which would not exist but for your expert intervention and involvement, is a program that focuses on getting citizens and especially students to become actively engaged in the process of becoming what we call heroic citizens. Not by simply reading and listening and regurgitating something that they read in a book or heard on a video, but by actually internalizing the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, of liberal constitutionalism, or, of a free and democratic society, by internalizing that through their own engagement with the material, through their own conversations. They appropriate that, they internalize that, and they thereby arm their own civic immune system, if you will, to become effective, active, useful, self-determining citizens in a free and democratic society.
There you have it. 3 questions, 3 answers. You better understand the Notwithstanding Clause, its history, and the current debate that's happening today, and more importantly, why this debate matters to our democracy and why that matters to every single one of us, no matter where we live and no matter what our age. Peter Biro, thank you for your time today and for all that you do for our democracy, and of course to our listeners. Thank you as always for tuning in. Until next time, over to you.